There's a building that's been standing in New Orleans for almost 300 years. The Ursuline Convent, 1112 Chartres Street. On the third floor, there are windows that have been sealed shut. Tour guides will tell you that those shutters were nailed closed with blessed nails by the Pope himself. The official reason? Hurricane protection. But ask anyone in New Orleans and they'll tell you the real reason. Those shutters aren't for keeping the weather out. They're for keeping something in. The story goes back to 1728. Ships from France, young women clutching small pieces of luggage, and the locals noticed something wrong immediately. Pale, they whispered about the women. Ghostly pale. They were so pale that when these women got off the ship, their skin began to blister and get red in the sun. And the luggage they carried were a little too long and too narrow, shaped like coffins. Some of these girls walked through the convent doors and were never seen again. Then in 1978, the story goes that two paranormal investigators tried to prove what was really up there in the convent. They set up shop with cameras and things like that overnight, and the next morning, they were supposedly found dead, drained of blood on the steps. Hi, I'm Danielle Romero. Thank you so much for being with me here on my channel where we talk about American identity and family stories. And I have been researching my family story in Louisiana for at least 3 years, and it's kind of blossomed into something much bigger, which has been really exciting. But if you'd like to connect with me off of YouTube, so many of my videos have been demonetized, flagged, taken down. Come on over to patreon.com/NYTN. Okay, so before we get into the vampire lore and the mysterious deaths, we need to understand what's actually happening in Louisiana in the 1700s. The story doesn't start with vampire horror, but it does start with a crisis, a population crisis. When the French were colonizing New Orleans, they had a serious problem. There were not enough people, specifically not enough women. The colony was overwhelmingly male soldiers, male traders, male convicts. Governor Jean-Baptiste looked around and realized we cannot build a colony without families. So he sent a request to the French government. Please send us unmarried women who can marry these colonists. This wasn't France's first rodeo with this idea. They'd actually already tried this 3 times before, importing women from France. So the first attempt was actually in Canada. 800 young women who were called filles du roi, or the king's daughters. These were young girls. Some I saw at maybe ages 12 up to 20s. A lot of them got married. The colony started growing, but then the rumors started. A French baron wrote that these women were of middling virtue, which was code for prostitutes. Was it true? No. Only, I think, 1 out of all 800 women was ever charged with prostitution, but the damage was done. The women's reputation was toast. So wave 2 was in 1704. These are the Pelican Girls. So there was a ship called La Pélican, arrives at Ship Island near Mobile. 23 women, ages 14 to 19, are carefully selected by church officials. We know their names. We have that. I'll leave a link to that below for you guys to see if your family's on there. But the problem is this ship stopped in Havana, Cuba on the way from France, Cuba, New Orleans. And what's in Cuba? What's happening? There was mosquitoes. There was malaria. There was yellow fever. And so when they come, they're bringing this with them, and it just tears through the colony. So most of the women survived. Most of the girls survived. They married, they had children. And so this is the beginning of Louisiana's French Creole population. And again, I'm going to come back to this part. So 3rd time's the charm, right? No. So wave 3 was in 1721. King Louis XIV goes to a women's prison in Paris, basically. He has people go to a women's prison in Paris. And they take 88 women. And they send them over to Mobile Bay. So in 1728, Bienville tries one more time to bring women over to this new colony. And this time something goes very, very wrong. So this time, The king has the women recruited from charitable institutions through the church. We're talking about like orphanages, convents. So these are poor girls, but they're guaranteed virgins. They're respectable. And they're called filles la cassette. A cassette is like a little piece of luggage. But when they come to New Orleans, they end up being called the Casket girls. So each girl's given a small chest called a cassette. And it has everything she owns in it, probably. You know, 1 or 2 changes of clothing, some linens, maybe a prayer book, just, you know, your whole life in this little box. And so August 1728, a ship docks and the girls file down the gangplank, clutching their little cassettes with them. They get off the boat and the French colonists start whispering and saying, these girls are really pale. I mean, the girls are. They are ghostly pale, and within minutes, they start getting burned in the sun, in the Louisiana sun. Their skin's getting red. And the cassettes, people notice, seem really long and narrow, and they look like coffins. The girls are taken to the Ursuline Convent, and the nuns are going to house them and take care of them until they can each get married. Men from the colony come to inspect the new arrivals and to choose their wives. And here's where the story gets dark. So some of the girls are rejected. They're too pale. They're too strange. And the ones who do marry, many are mistreated, placed in unwanted unions. Their husbands are continuing to have affairs with the native women, which was what the French governor was trying to prevent in the first place. And some of the girls, unable to find husbands, the legend goes, they're forced into prostitution. So then, King Louis hears about this mistreatment, and he's had enough, and he orders the girls, come back to France. So the Ursuline nuns prepare for the girls to depart. They take their cassettes, the coffin-shaped little chests, and carry them to the 3rd floor of the convent. When the nuns go to get the cassettes for the girls, when it's time to leave, the cassettes are empty. The nuns search everywhere. They're gone. The belongings have vanished. Fearing that the girls brought something supernatural with them from France, the nuns decide to seal the 3rd floor permanently. They bolt the doors, they nail the windows shut, they're blessing everything, crossing all over. Now the people are whispering a new word, not just pale. Vampires. Now let's go back to 1978. So 2 paranormal investigators decide to test this legend. So they set up outside the convent. They have cameras that are aimed at the 3rd floor. And the hours pass. It's midnight. It's 1 a.m. It's 2 a.m. Nothing happens. They fall asleep. According to the legend, the shutters started opening and closing. Opening and closing. Opening and closing. The cameras start malfunctioning. So we have no footage, of course. And the next morning, 2 bodies are discovered, totally drained of blood. Now, people have tried to find proof of this story, names, police reports, anything, and there's 0 documentation on this. But the story definitely gets repeated on tours. So there's no evidence that this happened. Now, here's the thing. There's zero documentation of vampire stories connected to the Casket girls in the 1700s. There's nothing in the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, until you get to 1976, which is 2 years before this paranormal investigation legend. What happens in 1976? Anne Rice publishes Interview with a Vampire, and the book is a massive bestseller. It makes New Orleans like the vampire capital of America, and suddenly tourists are flooding the city looking for vampire lore. And ghost tour companies kind of like pick up the slack there, but they need content. So someone, a very smart tour guide, I'm guessing in the 1970s, 1980s, remembers the story of the Casket girls. You have pale women, coffin-shaped luggage, a sealed 3rd floor of a Catholic convent, and you had vampires in there. So by the early 1900s, the Casket girls' vampire legend is considered like an established fact on all the ghost tours. Now, Anne Rice didn't invent this legend, but her novel definitely created this appetite for it. And New Orleans needed these vampire stories, so the city found them, even if they had to retrofit a 250-year-old story. So let's separate fact from fiction here. So what's real is that the Casket girls did arrive in New Orleans in 1728, and they did come from orphanages and convents, and they were young. And they did have these small cassettes with their belongings. They did stay at the Ursuline Convent until they were married, and many were mistreated and forced into unwanted marriages and possibly even prostitution. King Louis XIV did recall these girls back to France, and many were killed by disease, malaria, yellow fever, and there is a third floor. But the fiction part is that there's zero documentation of vampires before 1970s. Blessed nails from the Pope, no records, at least that we're allowed to see from the Vatican, exist. The cassettes looking like coffins, like, like, I don't really see it. I mean, I guess you can whip yourself up into seeing anything, right? The 1978 investigators, there's no police report, there's no names anywhere. Maybe you can tell me more information on that, but it doesn't seem to be a substantiated story. Windows sealed for 300 years. A lot of people say this is just the hurricane shutters, right, that you need down there. And you know, what's interesting is the word casket for burial wasn't even common until the mid-1800s, because in 1728, cassette just meant like a chest or a box. But over time, there was like this linguistic shift from cassette to casket, and I think that helped lay this groundwork for the legends. I'm pretty sure Nathaniel Hawthorne actually complained about this in a paper where he just complained about the use of casket, how it's like way too modern of a word, and he hates it, and he'd rather use coffin. Now, as far as the pale skin, if you think about being below deck on a ship for months and months, you're not going to be getting any sunlight, you probably have scurvy, no vitamin C, and you're going from that to Louisiana. And, you know, I've been in Louisiana in the summer, and it's hot. It's hot, and the sun is strong. And so, of course, you're going to have these girls looking super pale to people basically outside all the time. And of course, they're going to immediately get sunburned because people that are already probably naturally light, and then they're under deck, you know, for months. According to the Archdiocese, the third floor of the convent contains archival records and storage. In 2016, contractors did some renovation work, and they opened up those third floor windows, and what did they find? Nothing. Just dusty rooms with some documents, no vampires, nothing. But the archives downstairs does have information. Marriage records, birth certificates, letters, documentation of hundreds of young women who came through those doors, who were real women with real names, real lives, and real descendants. Maybe you're one of them. They're not trapped in the attic. They're actually everywhere, and probably thousands of family trees by this point. While the vampire story is fiction, I think the real story is actually worse. We're thinking about girls who are like 14 to 19, and they're orphans, and their choice was to marry a stranger in this paradise of the Louisiana territory or face destitution in France. It wasn't really a choice, and a lot of the girls were upset because they showed up and it wasn't what was sold to them in France. And I had read anecdotes about how like they wouldn't eat the Indian corn, they didn't like the food, they didn't like the weather, they didn't like anything. They're like, we don't like this. And when they arrived, you know, they're getting inspected like livestock, you know, and who knows what those relationships were like, right? A lot of old Louisiana cemeteries are full of young women's graves with just a name and a date. And so I think when they're on the ghost tours in New Orleans and the tour guides talking about these souls trapped in the convent, maybe they're not entirely wrong. The real horror isn't that these girls were vampires. I think the real horror is the trauma that many of these young girls went through. But there's another side to it too. For a lot of families, tracing your lineage to the Casket girls is actually a point of pride, because it meant your ancestors were the respectable women, not the criminals, the correction girls from 1721. And so many old Louisiana families claim Casket girl ancestry, which I think is super fascinating. I don't think I have ties to them, but I'm still looking. And I'm going to leave a link or two below in the video info box for you guys so you can see some of the last names on there. Even though it's a French story, it's really the most American story of all. You have something I think most American families have. Someone gets on a boat or a plane or crosses a border, carries their life in a bag, has 2 cents to their name in their pocket. And I think especially for Americans, we like to tell ourselves these stories about like, and we come from this brave pioneer heritage or this brave immigrant story. That's partially true, but a lot of times people just come to America because they're so desperate. They are so desperate. And the Casket girls were not pioneers. And their descendants became Americans who built lives, created culture in Louisiana through that trauma. So let me know if you've ever heard of the Casket Girls of New Orleans, and if you're curious about any of the other videos I've done on my Louisiana family, I'll leave a link to that below. Otherwise, we'll talk soon.